Nice to have you here, and I can see other people coming in. As David, Charles, Lewis. Okay, everybody, welcome. Today we're going to be doing something pretty cool, which is a hacking a demo, a live demo, and a live marathon delivered by none other than the rather legendary Andrew Martin. Hey, Andy, how's it going?
Good afternoon. It is going rather well indeed. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, we're really good, thanks. We're really good. We're looking forward to this. Now, as many of you know, you keep returning and you all return on time. This means that you like our announcements and you like our gossip, because if you didn't like them, you would come 15 minutes later, because it always takes us 15 minutes. So that's what we're going to do first. Before we get into our gossip and any further announcements, a bit of housekeeping. We do have a code of conduct and we do enforce that code of conduct. The summary is be nice and respectful to each other, otherwise we'll kick you out. And if your behavior is bad enough, you'll never come back to any of our events. You can find the code of conduct online if you want to take a more detailed look at it. And you can use the code of conduct for your own online events to create a safe environment for people in your community. And you can copy it. You don't have to acknowledge us. We don't really care. As long as it's been put to good use, that's fantastic. We are recording this demo. If you have a problem with that, we might be able to pixel you out in the video. You can always switch your camera off. But mainly, if you don't like to be recorded, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to leave, because we do like to record the webinars and then put them on the YouTube channel. We do this for a few reasons. Obviously, for the people who can't turn up, but there are some people who live in areas with bad internet connections, and if something is uploaded, then they can download that or stream it at a time that suits them, if, for example, they can't join live. But many parts of England have got bad internet connections. Okay, did I miss anything on the housekeeping, Carla?
I think we're good. Teresa, can you confirm?
Yeah, just ask the questions in the chat and then, we will collect it for the end. That's all.
Very good. Our first announcement then is an advertisement for a conference that's coming up. It is true, this is our conference, but they're all community events. So obviously, if you want to sponsor the event, come and speak to us, we'll take your money. But mainly, if you want to participate, the SRE Conference will be running from April the 28th. Usually they start early in the European morning and they go right the way through to the evening in the Eastern time zone of the US and even the Western time zone. Amazing speakers, amazing range of content. You can drop in if you're at work to a couple of sessions, drop back in later, and everything will be recorded. So if you can't see the shows or the talks that you're interested in, you can find them. And we're pretty quick. I think within a few hours or maybe 24 hours, the videos will be uploaded and ready to be consumed by you lot and the rest of the community. We are hiring. This is just a bit of a shameless plug for Container Solutions. We're always looking for engineering managers. We're always looking for cloud native engineers. But there is a small change at Container Solutions. And this is the small change. My friend Ian is no longer just an engineer, but is actually a partner at Container Solutions. Hello, Ian. Are you there?
I am. Hello.
Welcome back. Congrats on the new role. How does it feel? Power. You've got power.
It feels like I can take over the world, Jamie.
Amazing. And because of the work we're doing now, the consulting work we're doing, we do a lot of different things. We started off building awesome cloud native platforms and helping companies to migrate their applications. Then we started to do more consulting, more strategy work. So we got a bunch of new and emerging roles: solutions architects, senior consultants, and things I can't even remember. They're about to go live in the next week or two. But if you're interested in these really senior positions, specifically around complex problem solving at Container Solutions, that is the group that Ian leads. He will answer questions here in Zoom, or you can find him on Twitter, send him a DM, and he'll be able to give you an update about the team he's building and all of our ambitions for the following 12 and 24 months. Okay, gossip. I do believe we have got 2 new people for the gossip, and that is Cindy and that is Tibor. And I don't know what the gossip is, so I get to sit back and enjoy this. Biggest release of Golang yet. Who's taking this one, Cindy or Tibor?
That's mine. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go for it.
Okay.
Welcome to your. Is this the first time you're speaking at a What the Fucking Are?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, wow. How excited are you?
Mostly nervous, but yeah.
Oh, don't be nervous. You're with a very friendly crowd. What you have to do is you have to have a couple of drinks before you start. That's what I. No, I'm just kidding. So to everybody who's so this is Cindy. She works with us at Container Solutions, and she's coming to present her first bit of gossip. So Cindy, take it away.
Thanks. So yeah, Go 1.18 was released earlier this week, and it is one of the biggest releases since its inception. That was like over 10 years ago. And this new release includes new features, performance improvements, and a new pattern for writing code. So some of the things included in this release are generics, which, yeah, you can go online and see people arguing about it. I guess it's pretty divisive. There's also fuzzing, which is interesting, particularly to me, because it's about testing. Some improvements to workspaces, which is how you build your modules as you develop the code, as well as performance improvements for people who use computers with specific, like newer architectures, Apple M1, ARM64, and PowerPC 64. So yeah, why should we care? Golang is one of the most popular programming languages. Within Container Solutions itself, we have CS Labs, and one of our projects, External Secrets Operator, is written in Golang. Some of my peers have their own personal projects as well, such as Serdar. He has a guided tour of Go, and Tom Godkin has something called Go Functional. Also, generally speaking, Kubernetes operators can be written in Golang. So to learn more, Teresa will share the link to the actual Go blog. And that's my bit.
Oh,
So
you're
I
muted,
guess
Jamie, you're muted.
Wow, I was muted. I was saying that was I was saying that was an awesome round of gossip, but I think we should give a round of applause to Cindy. This was her debut. I have a question. Are Go generics as bad as Java generics?
I don't know enough about Java generics to say,
Yeah.
but I guess time will tell how much the community likes Go generics.
And you don't know about Java because you're not nearly 50, right? Is that correct? Don't have to answer that question. You don't have to answer that. Okay, thank you, Cindy. That was awesome. And it is true, we built lots of stuff in Go at Container Solutions, and at Christmas we all did the, what was that competition called, Ian? The Christmas programming thing we did, the Advent of Code.
Oh yeah.
It's
We
a,
did the Advent
yeah,
of Code. And for the first time in 7 years, I programmed in Java, and everybody else was doing Go. So lots of Golang is happening at Container Solutions in our open source projects, and of course with our customers. Okay, Tibor, you're next up. How can I use, or can I use Google Analytics in the European Union?
now that's a very provocative question statement. Like, I saw your face when you read that. Why is this even a question? So what happened in the past 3 months is that several European courts actually ruled against Google and partner companies with regard to their usage of Google Analytics. And while there's usually smaller complaints with the GDPR that usually is fixed by Google quite fast, the big question that looms is, and what the Austrian court found against Google is that under GDPR, you are not allowed to take European citizens' data out of the EU and into the US. Now, the Austrian prosecutor argued that that also means that if you can't guarantee that the data that you're processing is not going to be accessible by US intelligence agencies, for example, then you did not actually do a GDPR compliant job of storing data. So that might just mean that a company such as Google or Facebook or whoever, big tech in general, most likely won't be able to say with certainty that they can do GDPR compliant solutions with data storage in Europe. Now, this is a very tough topic. There's a huge amount of money going back and forth, and as such, coverage is always drawing to one side or another. So this is just something to keep in the horizon, because it generates a lot of uncertainty about where the whole adware business and e-commerce is going.
Very, very interesting. What do you think is going to happen, Tibor?
Well, one of two things, to be honest. One, another bunch of big fines which will be paid and business just goes on. Or what it can encourage, maybe European competitors can take advantage of this and provide solutions that would satisfy GDPR, and more competition is always good. So I'm actually excited to see what happens out of this. Very
cool, Tibor. Now, on that note, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Cindy for joining today and sharing the gossip with us. I like both of those pieces of gossip, actually. They were pretty different. You've had all the announcements, you've had the housekeeping, you've had our wonderful gossip section, which I know you all love, which means it's time to hand over to Andy. Andy, how are you doing? Andy, everybody, by the way, is the author of the O'Reilly book, Hacking Kubernetes, and is, of course, the founder of Control Plane, a pretty cool company based here in London, but actually, Andy, you deliver services all over the world, right?
That is entirely correct. And it has just occurred to me that I have a copy of the book with which to, well, to brandish, with which to wave. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to write that book with the delightful Mr. Hausenblas, Mr. Michael Hausenblas from AWS. And yes, indeed, we are a cloud-native software security consultancy with a focus on EMEA and North America, and a little bit of APAC as well. Very cool. And this is your first What the Fucker now, right, Andy? It is indeed. It is also the 0.1 of this talk. So I'm saying that to give myself as much space to make mistakes as possible. So Andy wants feedback. Give him the feedback in the chat, or send him a DM on Twitter. I'm going to be quiet now, Andy, and I'd like us all to give a warm welcome for his debut at our WTFs, Andrew Martin. Bravo, welcome. Thank you ever so much. Very, very kind introduction, and much appreciated. Let's share the desktop and see how we go. Okay, that is theoretically up and running and ready to roll. So again, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Welcome to the Hacking Kubernetes live demo marathon, aka the talk of the book. It is perhaps more of a canter than a marathon this time. And yeah, I welcome any and all feedback in person, via carrier pigeon, Twitter, etc. I am from Control Plane, as was introduced. We are a cloud-native security consultancy, and I'm very honored to be involved with these organizations on the left-hand side, and also coming from a development background as a classical computer scientist, but also having an inherent and deep interest in operational concerns, system uptime, the user, the customer. It is why we build systems. And of course, security is the layer that entangles and intertwines those things together to ensure that customers are able to use our systems in a safe and secure manner. This is the book itself. There is the smiling visage of Mr. Michael Hausenblas. One of my colleagues, Lewis Denham-Parry, our head of training, wanted to create a series called, now that's what I call Hacking Kubernetes 23. But in fact, it is just the first version, as I say, of the book. I was remiss not to insist on a goose. Instead, we have some Brazilian endangered duck, as O'Reilly I want to do. And the book is available as a free download in portion, the first half. It is also available, of course, from all good book resellers, and available on the O'Reilly online platform. Again, reviews and the like welcome. It's
really instructive to understand how people have accessed or indeed otherwise interacted with the book. So the book delivers this attack on a fictional organization. Boats, cranes, trains, logistics, so something like that, B control. And it features a dastardly and nefarious pirate captain called Captain Hashjack. We talk about threat modeling. We look at the problems of security holistically as they relate to an organization. It catches in my throat slightly as I say it. And we start from the microcosm of Linux in a container. And we build out to the pod abstraction. We look at the security boundaries and the trust boundaries in each of those things. We go through to what a kubelet is, what it does, how it's potentially compromisable. We look at the networking between the pods, both the CNI and underneath that. We investigate things like the topologies that we can deploy our clusters into, the cloud accounts, all the way up finally to your organization's security posture. And then again, how Kubernetes is adopted by an organization and how the configuration of an organization contributes into its security and also, of course, into the success of adoption. As I say, available from all good bookstores. Let's keep the mouse off the screen. Okay, what will we do today? First of all, we will talk about threat models. We will look at how we actually hack a thing. What is hacking? What are we talking about here? Then there is a demo run. We'll start with a supply chain, reverse shell. We'll go into detail on how that is achieved and what indeed the component parts are. We'll then look at container breakouts. Courtesy of one of my colleagues at Control Plane, we have a proof of concept for the dirty pipe breakout from a couple of weeks ago. There are then bits of further demos to go here. As I say, the longer version of this talk, dread the preparation for the longer version. The longer version of this talk will go into even more detail. I will deliver this talk at KubeCon, so a couple of things remain in the pocket. And then finally, a book giveaway to finish off. I'm standing high upon the shoulders of giants. There are many, many highly experienced and educated people who've done a great deal of preparatory work before this talk was even a glint in the proverbial long distance eye. They're all strongly recommended. Well, some of mine, which is probably a little facetious, but from KubeCon North America last year, very poorly physically attended, necessarily because of the global situation. I had the good fortune to be there and watch the Kubernetes Exposed 7 of 9 Hidden Secrets that will give you pause from Ian Coldwater and Brad Giesemann, a pair of SIG honk luminaries again. It's a great talk. 7 of 9 encodes a historical lesson that some of you who have seen the Kubernetes documentary may preempt. There's lots of interesting things in there. Kubernetes is just Linux. The way that things interact is, of course, still the same. We're putting different controls and abstractions, but when we're looking at things like one of the examples in there is DNS tunneling and how we exfiltrate data from hardened systems that don't have split horizon DNS and allow recursive lookups. Super interesting. There's loads of good stuff for even the most wizened and hardened security professional. There's also I've got a speed run here of from FOSDEM last year. This is a dirty cow breakout in 3rd position, running with scissors from Liz Rice. Is a keynote from a few years ago. Tim Allclair and Greg Castle are the Google security engineers who locked the orchestrator down in the first place. And finally, at the end, for live container hacking from probably about 4 years ago with my dear friend, Mr. Benjamin Hall, where we look at some of the attacks that you could do against Kubernetes back in the good old days. Okay, security teams do not like Kubernetes, and cloud native expertise is a relatively rarefied skill, as I'm sure that we all know. Why don't they like it? Well, because there are threats and there is a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of unknowns. First of all, we want to get into a threat modeling mindset to understand our adversary. Here we have the archetypal nemesis, Captain Hashjack. I'll detail more about him as we continue. Then, whoopsie daisy. Then we want to look at our threat sources. So what capabilities do our attackers possess? And therefore, what are the most likely and impactful attacks? Frankly, the risk of these different attacks against our systems. And then as a kind of straw man, consider the government versus a game development startup. Well, Valve have been targeted and they've had source code stolen. And of course, as we can see right now, the Pew map of the world and government intelligence agencies is blinding. They require very different defensive mechanisms, but fundamentally, the security baseline is very similar indeed. So what sort of adversaries may we be coming up against? Well, anything from a vandal, that is a script kiddie, perhaps me in shorts, through up to the extreme of foreign intelligence services and nation states. We should be cognizant of getting into the cars with fake taxi livery on the outside. At certain points, technical defenses become useless because the individual is targeted. So everywhere in between, really what we're looking at here with the nefarious Captain Hashjack is a state-affiliated cyber criminal. So this might be a fancy bear or kind of one of the APT groups, which are ultimately sponsored by their state, but plausibly, deniably, just on the side sufficiently to not be, I was going to say brought up in negotiations, but of course there was a case with the Revil ransomware gang at the beginning of this year, where they were noticeably shut down by the Russian state after pressure from the US government. So it's not as cut and dried as maybe it could be. But the point here is that this adversary, the 8-bit monstrosity Captain Hashjack, is attacking our systems, and we will use him to threat model how we defend them. So it's worth noting, this is it's kind of old adage. He says 2015 being sufficiently far back for me to utilize the word old. Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. What does that mean? Well, this is why we perform threat modeling. We're fastidious and assiduous with our identification of threats, because as a defender, we only need to make one mistake, potentially, before our defenses are compromised. For an attacker, it is continuous traversal. It is swinging through the branches in a jungle. It's parkour over rooftops. If an attacker can leap between two adjacent branches, they can pivot, they can enumerate the next set of places that they look to attack, and they can observe the visible horizon over the leafy canopy. This gives an attacker a route to continue to dig into an organization. Contrast from a defensive perspective. The distance between branches is only one of the things that we need to look at. We care about the forestry, the health of the trees, the way that they're pruned, their height, the management of the forest, the ecosystem that a healthy forest fosters. In the first instance, we are concerned with the forest even being there at all. So the list of concerns that we have, literally in this case, a list, means that we need to tick everything off. Whereas for an attacker, you just need to jump between things enough times until you hit pay dirt somewhere. So we build attack trees. This is why we think in lists. We can use threat models and attack trees to enumerate all possible disaster scenarios and catastrophe cases that may be present in our systems. Control Plane has put significant effort into this, and these are threat models we generated for the CNCF's Financial Services User Group. This gives us a quantifiable way of identifying what's going on in a system. These are published under the Financial Services User Group in the CNCF. And of course, we provide threat modeling training with O'Reilly. We will also do this privately, should you so desire. And this helps to generate key controls to apply for your cloud native systems. This is all great, but what if we don't know anything about Kubernetes? We need to really understand, in a sort of Sun Tzu art of war style, what we're attacking in order to truly defend it. Rather, we need to understand how to attack what we're defending. You get the idea. Okay, let's jump into the demo marathon. We'll start with the supply chain. How do we get into somebody's cluster? Supply chains are so hot right now. They are long. They're difficult to protect. Typically, what we're looking for as an attacker is remote code execution in a victim cluster. So in this case, we will generate our own remote code execution via a supply chain attack. This is grossly oversimplified, but nevertheless. Here we have the dastardly and nefarious pirate captain Hashjack's vessel. And as you can see, when we're looking at this supply chain advancement to production, we trust a certain set of producers. They might be our operating system package repository maintainers. They may be some random maintainer in Nebraska, as per XKCD. I'm sort of propping up the internet. That person exists, incidentally, whether accidentally or not. They may be the vendors that ship us closed source software. And we have examples, SolarWinds being the hackneyed and oft used attack from last year, where that trust relationship from the provider to the consumer was abused with an upstream injection attack. So in this case, if Captain Hashjack can get his malicious code into a third-party dependency, the developers will compile it or build it into a container. We have a trusted application, and our Kubernetes are likely to be compromised. So what is hacking? What does this look like? First, we observe the thing, we generate a payload, then we weaponize it. We deliver that payload, in this case, via a container. And this is our supply chain attack in this case. Then we exploit it, which is the actual running of that container in a production system. The installation of the backdoor, in this case, is a reverse shell, which I'll detail momentarily. We use command and control. This is remote access. This is, what is it called? Is it PC Anywhere? The kind of thing you used to use to fix your grandmother's computer in the 90s. And then finally, action on objectives. That is the progression of this talk. Once we have gained control of a container in production, we then escalate our privilege up to a point that ideally we can take over a victim's cloud account. That is game over. So why is that game over? Because we have the 4 C's of container security: the code, the container itself, the cluster, and the cloud colo or corporate data center. The code itself must be secure. This is application security. We've put a lot of industry effort into shifting left, into running tooling within our IDEs, static analysis and pipelines. We know these practices. Next, we have the container. The container is a combination of the file system at rest. Is that configured so that everything is owned by the root user, or is there sensible Linux-based separation of privilege? It is also the container as invoked, the instantiated container, if you like, at runtime. These are our namespaces, C groups, capabilities, our Linux security modules, all the good things that Linux makes available to us. Those run on the cluster. Again, we know how we should secure a cluster: admission control, network policy, intrusion detection, these basic things that are required because nothing inherently is secure. And finally, our cloud and colo. What happens if the cluster is popped and someone is able to own the cluster? Can they escalate to owning the cloud account? Absolutely not. They should not be able to. Is it possible? In many cases, yes. Here we see the MITRE attack framework and the Tower of Network Security, just repackaging the same attack chain, if you like, that we saw on the previous page. And with this supply chain reverse shell. So what is a reverse shell? It is the victim machine making an outbound connection to a public IP that the attacker controls. So we force the victim to run malicious code, the implant, the exploit, the malware. The victim runs that code inadvertently, and that causes a connection back to the attacker with permissions of the user that ran the code. The attacker has then established command and control. What does that look like, I hear you ask? We'll come back to this in a moment, but at the bottom here, we sneak malicious code into a target library. That and trusted producers are in the same sphere. The dependency then ends up in a malicious container image that runs in production. So CI/CD is, of course, involved in that building. It hasn't detected this malicious code, maybe because it's either custom written or it's actually, for whatever reason, let's say. The payload then runs in the production container, and that triggers a reverse shell and data exfiltration. So there is an ingress here, there are firewalls. We can't send packets through from the internet that are not sanctioned or permitted by our firewall or ingress configuration, but we can often punch out back through a firewall. This is categorically insane for what it's worth. This is why log4shell was so bad, because people weren't protecting outbound socket instantiation from within their production environments, which is just bananas. But anyway, nevertheless, the cost of these extra security measures is complexity and maintenance. So there is a balance, but for high value systems, there's absolutely no question. So the reverse shell then connects back to this open port with a shell catcher, and we've gained control of the pod. We will run this magical one-liner from reputable goose, Mr. Duffy Cooley, field CTO at Isovalent, and he and Ian Coldwater dropped this one-liner. You'll have to take my word that it's a one-liner without the breaks in 2019. What are we looking at here? Well, friends don't let friends run privileged containers, and these are the reasons why. We will run host PID, so the process namespace will be shared between the container and the host. The container that starts is an Alpine container with the nsenter command mounting the proc namespace from PID1, which is our init system, which is systemd to all intents and purposes most days, and run bash with the mount namespace of the host inside the container. Our security context is privileged. This is admission control 101. Pod security policy is now pod security, but nevertheless, this is prevented with sensible policy at pod cluster admission time. So we will run a backdoored image on the target cluster. That will fire a reverse shell to an endpoint that I'll stand up as well. We'll catch the shell, establish command and control to the container, and profit. He says that's not the right page. Let's do that instead. Okay. I hope that this is suitably visible. Do make noise if it's not. And off we go. So first of all, here is one I prepared earlier, the Ngrok shell catcher. So first of all, Ngrok is network grok. It is a TCP forwarding service that is blocked on many corporate networks because it allows arbitrary TCP forwarding. So I have here a listener. That listener has been forwarded by Ngrok down here. So I have a public IP. The public IP is encoded up here. This is a reverse shell, and this is a one-liner. As you can see, we are going to do a dry run to generate a pod manifest. We'll then set out to add host PID and a security context, and then apply the thing to the cluster. Okay, that is not validated. Wonderful. Unknown fields privileged. Why? Because that's, for some reason, not the right level of indentation. I love live debugging. Okay, that's created. At the point that that starts, it should connect into here. Boom. Okay, so just to remind you what has happened here, we have run this malicious image here. The payload has fired this shell. I've caught this shell, and this is now running code in this front end pod. So within that container. Okay, well, relatively simple. What's actually happened here? Well, in this case, because the pod that we've deployed has unfortunately shared the host namespace for processes, we can see all of the processes on the host from within the pod. Is that a good idea? Absolutely not. Are we running Falco on the host? Well, thank goodness, at least we have detection capabilities, even if we haven't prevented the attack in itself. And we can see all sorts of terrible things here, like the container dshim, runc. These are the low-level components that run containers. They should not be visible from within inside the container. This smashes the container abstraction. We've broken the PID, the process namespace. But to some extent, this is, of course, what we wanted to do. What else happens when we're running privileged containers? Well, we unmask the /dev endpoint. So we can see all sorts of good stuff in here. We can see all of the host's disks. Well, that probably doesn't make any sense to us from inside a container as well. Once more, we're supposed to have these namespaces that give us abstractions away from the kernel. And I won't waffle on about, I won't waffle on anymore, but about the micro VM comparison. The difference between a micro VM and a container is the secondary Linux kernel. Whereas with a container, we're running on a single Linux kernel, and vulnerabilities in that kernel can be exploited to break out directly onto the host. In this case, we're also seeing the host resources, including other glorious things like the loopback adapters and terminal sessions of people on the box. Of course, the NSenter part to this now is, so we're within this shell, but if we run namespace, oops, can I get back here nicely? Nope. So we don't have full terminal control, as you can see, because of the way that the reverse shell works. So I'll just highlight this instead. Namespace, enter. The mount point will be set to the same mount point as the process ID1 namespace mounts symlink. Unix time sharing, which is our host name, interprocess communication, our network namespace, and our process namespace. And then we'll start bash. We are now, it says, we're now on the host. So if we check what is running, what is on the host, we can see, well, actually, Chrome OS post install. Chrome OS is a sort of Gen 2 derivative. It uses the Omaha. It's what Core OS was baked from as well, the Omaha update system, which has changed. I can't remember what that's called now. Nevertheless, this is the host. This is an awful day. We've essentially just broken out of a container. Friends don't let friends run privileged containers, but the important thing here was that we got in via a ostensibly supply chain attack, where just the presence of somebody running a malicious piece of software or invocation in a container gives us access to their cluster. That's remote control. So let's have a look back here. So we ran this backdoored image on target cluster. It fired this reverse shell. So it's just a TCP connection to the attacker controlled endpoint. The reverse shell was caught, and we've established command and control. Profit here is one flavor of routing the host. And then, of course, we went through this. But let's have a look at a more aggressive way of doing that. So that's all well and good. That's the first stage of a hack. It's getting a foot in the door, the proverbial chink in the armor, the weak point in the defensive wall. Let's move on to dirty pipe. Again, the marvelous Sikonk give us Mr. Brad Giesemann, who is now a security engineer at Aqua. It's not a container escape. It's a process that wants to be free, he cries evocatively. Very generous reading from a lovely man. What are we doing with a container? Okay, first of all, within a pod here, we have an example pod with two containers. So we'll ignore the pause container for now. These are two workload containers. Do we have the user namespace on in Kubernetes? Absolutely not. Would we like it? Ideally, it's an entry point for a lot of container breakout bugs. So we have a bit of a dichotomy. The ultimate decision is it won't be turned on until it's version 2. Notably, unprivileged containers use subordinate unprivileged user namespaces, which an operating system like Debian turns off by default because of this entry point to kernel bug issue. Whereas other distributions are less security-minded, paranoid, thin line. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, as dear Mr. Cobain once told us. So what's the point here? We have two containers. In the middle, we have our container workload. This is our process. This is the file system in which it resides. So all of these things in the workload. We have C groups surrounding them. These are our resource accounting C groups. I'll just whiz onto this quickly. C groups version 1 is essentially broken in many ways. Here's how to break out of a C group in one tweet, which is really, again, 2019, which is really something. We saw C groups break out last week, again, I think. C groups v1 continues to cause problems. C groups v2 comes from inside Facebook, who decided to build everything around systemd and Linux primitives instead of containers. It's all the same mechanisms, it's just not quite the same. It's not Docker, let's say, or runc or podman, as we now abstract it to. C groups v2 involves all sorts of crazy maths and lots of, yeah, I won't get too much more into it, but it's far more secure. And actually, we're talking about C groups v1 with most of the breakouts. So we have the workload, we have C groups, we have our mount namespace here, which is within the container. This can be busted open with mounts in from the host. They're normally tempfs partitions, but we can do direct volume mounts from the host too. Our process namespace we've seen. That's the isolation model for a container within a pod. The shared namespaces then for containers within a pod. The shared storage, this is something else that we may mount in. We have a single network namespace for both of those pods, apologies, for both of those containers within a pod. They share the same localhost adapter as we see here. They also share the same IP, essentially. They combine to, they share the same, yeah, the same ports on the same adapter. Interface communication, host name, we don't care about so much. And then default pod configuration and our Linux security modules, we care about deeply. These are one of our lines of defense. The adage is such that containers are not the security boundary. They are de facto used in that way, but we should be cognizant there are plenty of ways out and through them. And one of them is dirty pipe. This is a vulnerability. It's been in the kernel for a little while. It's similar to dirty cow in that it exploits things left in memory, let's say. So I think at this point, it's a 2-week-old vulnerability in the Linux kernel. It is similar to dirty cow, as I say, which is a copy on write vulnerability from a few years ago, where an unprivileged user can inject code into a root-owned memory page, escalating their privilege, running code as that root user. So in this case, we're taking advantage of an issue within the Linux kernel itself. This is difficult to defend against because once the Linux kernel fails to protect a container, we can break straight out of that container onto the host. Container breakouts are a fact of life. They will continue to occur. There are plenty of latent issues within the monolithic multi-million lines of code Linux kernel. And it's table stakes for using software that inevitably the intense complexity of these things harbors these bugs. Would we prefer no bugs and no software? Well, no, it's table stakes. We have to accept these things, but this is why we utilize defense in depth to detect these things when they occur. In this case, we should note that this vulnerability was dropped quite aggressively. There was not a great deal of notification for vendors. It is probably still widely exploitable. And because of a side effect of the vulnerability, it's possible to write through the overlayfs file system onto the host, which means unlike the way containers should be used, it's possible to modify a container image at rest from inside a container, plant a backdoor in a container image. That's pretty serious. So kudos to my colleague James Cleverly Prance, who has built the containerized version of this exploit. We will not release a weaponized version, but there is something coming. Okay, so what have we got here? We are in a vagrant box. We are an unprivileged user. And we are going to build a container. Okay, so what are we doing? We are, first of all, emulating runc. So I say that, that's a bit generous. We're creating a binary that we're going to drop over runc. You may remember the proc self exe bypass from a couple of years ago, where a symlink within the proc file system was exploitable by the entry point of a container so that the container process could write back along that symlink. This takes advantage of an age-old assumption in Linux before anybody was thinking about containerization or subdivision of namespaces within the kernel itself. The fix for this from runc was to copy runc into memory and run it from there, as opposed to leaving a link back through to the disk from the symlink tree. So what we're doing is we're building a binary here, and it has to be under 4K because of the page size writes possible from this exploit, and preparing that so that it will be executed. So it's written down the symlink, it's then executed, that fires our reverse shell into the container where we're sat listening, and we will break out onto the host. As you can see, as with the original proc self exe bypass, we take advantage of libseccomp to mess with this a little bit. This is our part of the exploit, and then we're off running the thing itself. Let's do the business. So we are built the container, we're running it, we're now trying to patch in, and there's sort of up to 10 seconds or so where we're listening on, I will actually SSH it again. So, oh, there we go. As soon as I opened the other page, that worked. So we're sat listening on, so we're globbed to all addresses on the adapter, just for the sake of it. The connection received from this on the IP of the container, and we've got a prompt. What does this prompt say? It says that we're root. Where are we root? In the directory that the container exists in. Okay, well, this of course is a bad day. We are inside, and this is the point that we can then go and tamper with the image on disk. Of course, we can then, as you can see, we're actually on the Ubuntu, excuse me, the Ubuntu VM that we started off in up here, although with slightly different colors. So there we are. We have just broken out of a container onto the host. This has happened multiple times before. It will continue to happen into the future. Next generation process isolation is the foil for this kind of behavior. The extended version of this talk will go into that as well. I hope to see as many of you in Valencia as possible. I'm super excited to be there. Okay. As I say, there are root exploits latent in the kernel that we don't know about, and defense in depth is our only mechanism. We need to patch stuff. That's the only real fix for this. Maintaining recency of kernel versions can be difficult. It's the same for any critical software we have running as root. Criticality then is the path to exploitation to potentially pop a shell, a proper root shell. At this point, I'm going to try and speed run the last one. So what is a kubelet? I hear you ask. It is a collection of all these things. Incidentally, all these images are from the book. Thank you to the illustrators at O'Reilly. So what have we got? A kubelet with a container runtime. This is runc. This is how the containers run and how our workload runs. Probes, storage, container network interface, orchestrator injected environment variables. Hopefully there's very little in there because environment variables leak and are not a safe place for stuff. Sequence and config maps can go into these. They can also go into temp-fs mounts, which is far better. However, everything that exists within a container or a virtualized system or anything on a Linux box has to be an entity somewhere. We don't get to say a container exists in an ephemeral abstract state. It exists on the host as a process. Within the container, it's hidden and coerced, and we have different visibilities and windows through into how different things look, which is our namespace and LSM and the masking that's done on the file system. In this case, a secret mounted into a container is a temp-fs mount on the host. So what are we going to do here? From a rooted kubelet host, we will enumerate the file system contents, find some secrets. We will use those secrets and service accounts and then utilize stolen service accounts to trampoline through the system and escalate our privilege. Okay, so for the purposes of this, could just continue on from here, although I haven't tested that, so I won't. What are we doing? Okay, so first of all, let's deploy a pod with secrets. Yep, okay, that is deployed. And then let's SSH directly onto the box. So he says, I suppose I could. I'm tempted to try and do this in a slightly better way, which would be to use this. Can I do that? I wonder if I can for the sake of doing it. So what am I going to do here? I'm going to load in my attack tooling so that I can jump into here. He says that has not worked in the slightest. Why has that not worked? Yeah, okay, let's not bother with trying to run untested demos. Okay, so I have right, so here I am. I've just SSH'd in and I've now routed the box in the traditional operator style. Here I will then, here I will then pop my my attack tooling, which I hope is going to work properly this time. There we go. Okay. So now that I've got these tools in here, I can run my file system dump. So what's this going to do? It's just going to search. So if we have a look at the, if we have a look at what's actually on the disk here, we can see loads and loads of overlay, temp-fs endpoints. But what we care about is these. The volumes projected and mounted in by the kubelet for the containers. So if we use this file system dump tool, we can see we've got loads of service accounts up here. Now, I have other tooling that will enumerate those and basically spider off through a system. It's not very subtle. It will set off any form of detection that's present. There are other things that we can do here, he says, trying to get a view. So if we search for AWS, we can see there are secret keys mounted in here. Now, these secret keys play into the next part of this talk, and I have run out of time and preparation, so we won't go into too much more detail there. But what we've seen is that once we've routed a host, we can then escalate based on everything that's mounted or running in that host. At this point, we would be able to do a cloud account takeover, but instead, conscious of time, I will show you what happens when supply chains go wrong. No forklift trucks were harmed in the making of this GIF. So what happens next? Well, various different types of breaches we can have in a container, in a cluster rather. The book enumerates these in significant detail. I mean, just look how many pages there are there, hundreds and hundreds, almost 295 pages. Probably should have tried harder for the 300. You can try and do this yourself. Here is my mind map of how I enumerate things to assault inside a workload. Again, I would be remiss without talking about control plane. This is what we do for a living. We have some of the best people in the world in cloud native security engineering, penetration testing, and of course, the illustrious training department that I've already mentioned. Thank you for your attention. I hope that was sufficient canter, and thank you, Rescue Time. That was not distracting. Yes, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any difficult questions that you may have.
May I? Hi, Teresa. Hi, Andy. Hi,
Hey.
everyone. Sorry, I just unmuted myself, but I had a question regarding this last part of control plane. I'm not an experienced professional in Kubernetes. I just have some background in cloud data analytics projects. But this part is quite interesting of the security of cloud native technologies. But my main question and focused question was about for example, if I wanted to work for a control plane, a professional with no cloud native, I have some background in cloud technologies, but not in Kubernetes especially. how could a person like me adapt to learn these, or what kind of skills, hard skills and soft skills you are looking for, because by paying attention to a person that has no technical background on the Kubernetes or Docker area.
Yes, right. So it kind of depends on what your desired specialism is. We really very strongly believe in training. We take people at various skill levels, and in my opinion, aptitude is more important than experience. So if people can demonstrate that they care about the subject matter and that they want to learn, then by all means do reach out. Perhaps there's a kind of more customized training plan that would be necessary for people to transition from one set of skills into something more cloud native. But fundamentally, although the paradigms shift, there are so many good books, I don't include mine in that, that there are lots of cloud native patterns and topologies that you can pick up just from getting an O'Reilly online subscription, or there's lots of Pact, Wiley, loads of great publishers out there. Yeah, so there's lots of information, and if you're concerned about how best and how to optimize your course through that, then feel free to reach out, and happy to discuss. Okay,
okay. And what about certifications? You have mentioned there in the job descriptions that at least OSCP or CISSP are some minimum requirements, but are they compulsory?
Not necessarily. It does depend on the specialism. For the security professionals, because we work with a lot of regulated industries, we find those useful. OSCP, of course, is a kind of 24-hour hardcore exam.
Yes.
It doesn't actually cover the cloud native work that we do necessarily, but just like somebody who has self-studied to achieve a thing, it's a sign of, again, aptitude. And
okay.
So yes, no compulsion for those. Always happy to have a discussion.
All right.
Perfect. Thank you, Priyan, for your questions. There was another question in the audience. I will try not to stumble upon my words too much. The supply chain attach has the remote shell IP in the code. Would it be possible to detect at CI time?
That's a good question. A more advanced version of this would probably use maybe wildcard DNS, or I struggle to remember the Malwarebytes dude who shut down Mirai, was it? Did so because and this kind of changes slightly once we're talking about actually attacking production systems. Then I'm kind of slightly hesitant to talk about exactly how things should be best obfuscated, but suffice to say, things like a deterministic function, like a hashing function, of course, that will take in a random number from a seeded random number generator. So you know that today we'll use this seed, this salt, you get this hash. So you know for the next infinite period of time which DNS crazy string will be used for your command and control for that day. It would require, of course, resolution of that DNS to go into that specific reverse shell. The bash dev TCP binding. But yes, there are looking at how best to do that is kind of more of a malware, piece. But yes, there are plenty of ways to obfuscate that as well.
Cool. There is another question, Andy. It might be a trivial question, but how would an attacker try to attack clusters that are unnecessarily exposed to the internet? Maybe, for example, a private cluster in GKE that has no accessible public IP or endpoint.
The attack that I demonstrated here can be used in that way. So let me just jump in there. I came back to the slide incidentally for free book links. There we go. I'll drop in there. Let me just go to reverse shells, supply chain reverse shell. So for the purposes of this demo, I deployed this myself. However, we can remove the ingress from this diagram and the exact same attack works. Of course, I would not then be deploying this, but in a production case with an offline system, once that malicious code is snuck into a target library, this process still remains the same. It really depends when we're saying a private cluster of GK has no accessible public IP or endpoint. At some point, that cluster will touch a network. Now, if there is an internet gateway that allows, for example, the application to, maybe it's accessing a remote system, that's a possible, that's then something that can break out. Because you don't have to have routing into a cluster, of course, to have routing out. It just depends on the way your network's gateways are configured to get that traffic in. If the cluster is fully air-gapped, then it's a different question. Then you can watch a Stuxnet documentary and sort of look at how difficult it can be to get code into the air gap, or sorry, across the air gap. There are nefarious ways of defeating air gaps. Again, a lot of it's kind of research-based. PC speakers, the same kind of, I don't remember this clearly, but the same kind of class of attack as Rowhammer can be used to generate electric signals from RAM writes. I don't know what sort of, I was going to say baud rates. I don't know what sort of bit rate you'll get for the bandwidth of those signals or how close you have to be, but there are plenty of ways to defeat air gaps. CRT monitors could be read, could be observed remotely. Of course, I'm kind of bridging between desktops and headless servers in this discussion. Would a headless server have PC speaker? Probably, but will it be drowned out by the noise of a data center? Probably. Could you then get another, completely brainstorming, but could you then find your way to a co-located racked piece of equipment with a microphone on it? Well, probably not. Would you be able to detect some sort of signal from the next machine? Hopefully not in the data center. So yeah, for a full air gap, it becomes a lot more difficult. Attackers will generally, unless it's a very targeted attack, go for low-hanging fruits. So anything we can do to sort of raise the bar helps. In this case, specifically for this example, that would be if outbound internet access is needed, it should go through a proxy. TLS 1.3 intercepting proxies are hard. Service meshes suddenly become useful because they will unbundle some of the TLS. We're into kind of deep application topology here. It is possible to do. It's not very easy to just drop in. But yes, there are mechanisms to support that. Sorry, excuse me. There's another question here, which I'll just jump in on if that's easier, Teresa.
Yeah, it's up to you for sure. Go ahead.
Cool. Okay, so Dan says, if the system allows outbound connections to the public network, even if it goes through a reverse proxy, would this attack be effective? I ask this because we're currently, there are fears that an agent can potentially become an attack vector. Any privileged application, any root-owned application should be threat modeled. And that's why we do that threat modeling process, because we would say for everything running as root, what's the supply chain like? How many times has this been compromised before? Do we trust the vendor? Do we trust how it's installed, X, Y, Z? And then we can order our controls and implement them in a risk-based order of precedence. But specifically the question, if we're allowing outbound connections to an internet, let's say, even through a reverse proxy, would this attack be effective? It depends on the configuration of the reverse proxy. If the reverse proxy is saying, well, this sensitive system can only do point-to-point mutual TLS with this IP, then we block this attack, because getting that reverse shell requires access from the deployment over the internet. So if we can, if we can firewall point 4 in any way, or put a gateway here that has limited IP forwarding capabilities or reverse proxying capabilities, boom, we've helped to prevent this. There are still other mechanisms. As I've said, all we're talking about here is TCP command and control. What about DNS command and control? It's really, really nasty to try and defend. Split horizon DNS, where different resolutions for different domains are managed differently, is again contextually complex and difficult to manage. So preventing command and control, yes, that should absolutely be the goal. At what point do we try and prevent a motivated attacker from command and control in this way? Probably you can't, I mean, you can completely prevent it, but it's difficult. So at some point, prevention becomes detection because of the cost of operating in a preventative way. And we say, well, actually, instead of blocking all possible outbound anything, TCP, UDP, ICMP, don't know of any ICMP attacks, to be honest. Well, not specifically in a useful way here. Instead of blocking all those things, instead we measure them and say, well, actually, we're now seeing an uptick, an anomalous behavior. And then that's set to an alert, perhaps an auto remediation that isolates a highly sensitive cluster or set of computes. Yes, kind of meandering around that a little bit. Wonderful, trusting vendors off SolarWinds has become a bit harder. Yes, yes, indeed.
Cool, guys. So before I ask the questions that I have up my sleeves, I would like to encourage everyone to take this opportunity and ask Andy all the burning questions. But here, some people left at their registration. Do you use any tool to detect and fix vulnerabilities before the deploy in Kubernetes?
Yes, absolutely. Minimum viable cloud native security is analysis of dependencies. And that is these third-party dependencies here, operating system, application, or vendor, as well as the application, I say as well, so the operating system, the application, anything from the vendor, they should be scanned. And that's because when a CVE is published, we should at least know and have the opportunity to make a risk-based decision as to whether or not we want to deploy that to production or continue to allow it to run in production. There are multiple scanners that do this. In the spirit of open source, Aquasex Trivi is a pretty comprehensive one. The actual vulnerability feeds used to all be paid for. Aqua basically gave it all away for free. So yes, absolutely. If nothing else, scan your application dependencies, contents of your container file system, and make a risk-based decision on the outcomes. If you want to get a beer and talk about CVE and vulnerability analysis, it's a whole different conversation, and yeah, quite a complex issue to yes, to solve.
Great, thank you, Andy. There are some more questions. Does enterprise Kubernetes solutions fix some of the vulnerabilities shown in your presentation, like OpenShift?
Does OpenShift fix some of the vulnerabilities? Let me think about this. That's a hell of a question. So what are we saying? So does OpenShift prevent a supply chain attack, command and control? Not by default. It's still possible. Does it prevent container breakouts? Well, Podman shares so much code with runc. It's basically a runc fork. The rootless code is shipped by the same guy, Akihiro Suda, an NCC developer in Japan. I mean, that is a great disservice, actually. There's also there's 2 or 3 other really excellent developers in shipping all that stuff. He's just one of the more visible ones. Would it prevent, what was the third thing I did? Host enumeration. No. So OpenShift has a slightly hardened posture, which helps with the way a workload sits, with project isolation, with pivoting between projects within OpenShift. But ultimately, these are problems at a deeper level, and they're problems that require specific remediations that are often not shipped by default, because I always get in trouble for saying this. Kubernetes is not targeted for security. It's targeted as kubeadm for developer productivity. And what that means is we have to attach security. It's not secure by default. We don't get a pod security policy by default. We don't have black hole network routing by default. Why not? It's a horrible first experience for a user. So Kubernetes made the right decision. Adoption is insane. It's the second busiest project after the Linux kernel itself. And adoption will keep the software alive. Will keep the orchestrator alive. There are a necessary set of caveats that come with that, and one of them is security has to come on a bespoke basis. Although there are, as I say, there are generalisms, it does need tuning for each specific application.
Great, thank you, Andy. I have one last question. So this is my last call for live questions before we finish the answer to the next. I am interested in firecracker, but I don't want to spend time doing undifferentiated heavy lifting, sorry. So I want to know if it is practical to use firecracker.
That is a great question. So firecracker and, well, first of all, I refer you to the book. Secondly, firecracker and gVisor are AWS and GCP's respective micro VM, next generation isolation technologies. What does that mean? It means, and this is kind of the, I'm actually going to reshare, find myself, managed to lose the appropriate window. How have I done that? There it is. Just a second, and I'll reshare this. There we go. I hope that is, I hope that's the micro VM slide.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So what we're looking at with Firecracker and gVisor is, instead of having isolation through a, well, okay, so actually, do I have a better? Okay, this part of the talk is obviously not written, and I don't have the right slide. Never mind. So if you run Fargate, you can run Firecracker in there. So is it usable? Yes. If you're running on App Engine or Cloud Run or GKE with the magic button checkbox ticked, then you can run on gVisor there. What do these things do? They abstract your workload from the Linux kernel. Why is that? Because the Linux kernel is written in C. C is not memory safe. There will always be vulnerabilities. And so a layer of abstraction between your workload and the kernel and the system call interface dramatically enhances the safety of a workload. At what cost? Well, there's a small performance penalty. I go into detail that there's a large chapter on this in the book. There's a small performance penalty. It's not very much. There is a very large debuggability penalty, and it is a different paradigm. The cost is not one of compute. It is one of cognitive complexity, let's say. So is it usable? Yes. And certainly is recommended for very high, I don't want to say high compliance, but because it's certainly not a compliance related issue. For highly sensitive workloads and for dangerous multi-tenanting of different data classifications, absolutely. But it really comes at a cost of some complexity, and you will be better off running as supported by the cloud providers, because these things are using, for example, virtualization extensions. You might need to reconfigure your BIOS settings, if you remember sort of the Intel VTX extensions and those kind of things that we kind of stopped having to mess around with. We're going back into that world. So yes, they're usable. There is some cost, and yes, I refer you to the book.
Thanks, Andy. Next question. What eBPF-based solutions like Cilium help to protect against the type of attacks you showed?
The trick and the end of this talk, which is absent, is the trick is to balance detective and preventative measures. So we prevent as much as possible with rigorous CI/CD, with developer workflows that feed back and type feedback loops, with sensible testing. So developers are in a contextual headspace where they can run a suite of tests and immediately fix things instead of pushing to an overnight build system that loses mental context and pulverizes the psychological concept of flow. But no preventative measures are nothing's entirely secure. No preventative suite of controls will entirely fix a problem. So we have to run detective controls as well. eBPF traditionally was purely detective. They are the extended Berkeley is the US pronunciation, Berkeley packet filters, and were historically asynchronous. Because Isovalent and Thomas Graf, their CTO, are also the organization and the people who are shipping eBPF features, eBPF is also now blocking in certain cases. What does this mean? It means that we can use eBPF to block outbound network connections. Absolutely. This is we can use network policy to block them, actually at a more fundamental level. And just any network policy is just a TCP or a UDP connection. There are also intrusion detection features in Cilium that would, for example, be able to notify for anomalous behavior. My workload suddenly making outbound TCP connections without an equivalent duplex, without an inbound TCP in the first place. What else do we have? The container breakouts, yeah, absolutely. Host intrusion detection system will say, someone's just popped a shell, someone's just run NSEnter. All these things can be blocked and should be. What else did we get to? Host enumeration and stolen service account credentials. Preempting the sort of long version of this talk, yes, again, there are ways to sneakily use intrusion detection in there as well. And yes, so that absolutely firewalling from a network policy perspective, but with any network policy will do. Cilium has some detection capabilities in there which are useful, but so do other non-eBPF based things. The real advantage of eBPF is the low latency TCP analysis, because everything's operating within the kernel and we're not context switching back into user space, so it can run more controls more quickly.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Andy. I see we don't have any other questions. My sleeve is empty right now.
Sorry,
yes.
Teresa.
Yes.
Just have a few questions, Brian, again here, regarding the recruitment part. I'd like to know the stages of the recruitment process, and also if you are hiring worldwide.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I would like to ask you if you can contact Andy via Twitter DMs. His DMs are open. If you don't mind, that would be really, really nice.
Okay.
If you have any question related to the talk, we will be more than happy to, of course, answer. But otherwise, Andy, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we are so excited to have you at the end of April in our SRE conference. I can't wait. So if you want to see Andy again, don't forget to register. And yeah, thanks everyone for your time today. Thank you for joining us. And we will see you in our next, I think in June is the next one, because we have the conference and then we are traveling a bit around with other conferences that are happening in May. So
yeah, we are gonna be at KubeCon, by the way.
Oh yes,
you can come and say hi.
Yeah, don't forget to stop by our booth. There will be some presents for you, for sure. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. and take care. See you next time.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.